The screen glowed like a verdict. $100 million slid from a fortress bank into a trust that did not carry his family name. Richard Whitmore stood alone in the private lounge above the gala, the city jeweled beneath him, the jade and ivory board stranded mid-battle. Wealth had always obeyed his touch, now it moved without asking permission. In the muted glass he caught his reflection, the cut of power, the posture of victory, the face suddenly drained of purpose. Somewhere below, crystal laughter still chimed, unaware that an empire had just blinked. He felt the building's quiet hum, like a pulse fighting panic. The trust bore a modest surname that should never have entered his ledgers. The machine of his life had run flawlessly for decades. Tonight, a small hand had reached inside the gears and stopped them cold. Moments earlier, his voice had filled the ballroom like a brass instrument, confident and performative. He had seasoned the air with mockery, his smile rehearsed for cameras, his words designed to bruise without leaving marks. Polished guests leaned in, delighted to witness the sport of humiliation dressed as wit. Waiters floated by with flutes of light. A string quartet stitched a soundtrack around money. He had pointed his cruelty where it usually found no resistance, then basked in the nods that follow power. The laugh rolled up to the chandeliers and back down, gilded and merciless. He had considered it culture, the ritual of reminding the working poor whose house they cleaned. It is easy to be generous when no one can afford to refuse you. It is easy to be brave with risk that never touches your skin. Pride tasted like champagne.
The notification had not simply announced a transfer, it had pronounced a judgment. Compliance teams, lawyers, trustees, each piece had aligned without friction because the paperwork below was airtight and public. He stared until the numbers lost edges, until the decimals swam. Money meant motion, strategy, leverage, the next turn in a lifelong harvest. Tonight it meant absence. He felt the sensation of stepping onto a stair that was never there. Gravity exposed him. Somewhere between mockery and midnight, his certainty had gone brittle. The board downstairs still wore his fingerprints, king tilted a fraction, knights angled like threats. Yet meaning had migrated. The story that began as spectacle had shed its costume and returned dressed as consequence. For the first time since he learned to read balance sheets, he could hear the bottom falling out. Silence acquired weight. The future arrived, uninvited. Hours before, the doors had opened like jaws. Inside, chandeliers poured light over marble, and a river of black fabric and jeweled tones flowed toward the auction stage. Linda Hayes slipped through that river unnoticed, the way rain travels a gutter, inevitable, small, necessary. Her hands knew other rooms by scent and texture, not by pedigree. She had learned to fold herself around wealth the way a shoreline accepts tides. At her side, Claire carried a paperback in the patience of a child raised on thrift and wonder in equal measure. The girl measured the room not by paintings and pedigrees, but by patterns, angles, timing, the way glances grouped like pieces preparing an opening. The set awaited upstairs, legendary, carved and cold. Far from it, in a pocket of quiet near a service door, the working world breathed, steady and unseen.
At the precise hour when fortunes like to be admired, a rumor of anger moved through silk. A deal had faltered elsewhere in the building, and Richard Whitmore, dressed in victory's architecture, came hunting for a substitute triumph. He found a target that could not afford to defend itself. The speech he delivered was not a speech, it was a scalpel. He narrated the gulf between thought and labor as if it were nature, not arrangement. He presented intellect as a private inheritance, and the maid as proof that some families never received the invitation. Laughter accepted his thesis. It was the old country club catechism: refinement over sweat, pedigree over practice, game over need. The insult landed clean and quiet, the way snow erases footsteps. But shame has heat, and it traveled through a daughter who had learned to turn heat into focus. A small figure separated from the wall's shadow and stepped into light that was never meant to warm her. She did not carry spectacle with her, she carried deliberation, the kind that looks like still water until it moves. Heads pivoted the way they do when the script is broken. A simple dress met a room staged for excess. She did not ask permission to be equal. She arranged equality inside herself and held it steady. In her mind lived a board older than marble, a pattern of squares where hierarchy misleads and patience rules. She had practiced on splintered wood beneath winter breath, learning that the world sometimes grants dignity only after you demonstrate you can survive without it. The room mistook silence for fragility. Silence is also preparation. Somewhere, a metronome began. Pulse, breath, memory, square by square, assembling a battlefield inside a child.
What began as theater acquired ink. Paper arrived, hard as law, soft as hubris. Witnesses leaned closer, not comprehending that a pin in the wrong mood can become a weapon. The terms arranged themselves with the cool grammar of transactions, an irrevocable trust, a charity veneer, a condition appended like a razor. Cameras hovered, applause waited like a fuse. When signatures met the page, two worlds clicked together, one with marble floors, one with linoleum dreams. The rich man sought spectacle that could be reversed by charm. The working woman saw a storm that could wash her from payrolls without leaving puddles. The child saw lines and junctions, the way consequences link like chains. Somewhere within the language, the machine locked. If power loves any sound more than laughter, it is the reassuring scratch of permanence. Tonight, permanence belonged to witnesses. The pieces settled into their old arguments. White reached first, not with fanfare, but with a humble step. A pawn moved like a whisper, a declaration that control begins at ground level. The room exhaled in relief. It recognized this rhythm, a game that lets everyone pretend the rules are neutral. Richard replied with ornamented force, a flourish learned in offices where pressure is decoration. Knights leapt into relevance. Bishops cut quiet diagonals like rumors. The board became a city, and the city became a board. Far from the squares, a mother found her hands shaking above a tray she could not steady. Near the rope line, donors turned into commentators. The child never searched the crowd for approval. She owned a smaller audience, breath, bone, memory of a veteran's hand guiding hers to the center, then home, then forward again.
Power performs best with spectators. He curated his expression to harmonize with money's expectations, every move an assertion of inevitability. He spread confidence across the room the way a general unveils a map. Here we build pressure, here we crack resolve. The board, for him, narrated a familiar story about simplification. Reduce complexity until all resistance looks inefficient. In the reach of his arm lived 1,000 meetings where compromise meant someone else's layoff slip. He had climbed by naming losses progress. Tonight he mined the same vein, dressing risk as entertainment. Arrogance is a lullaby sung to oneself. It drowns the small alarm bells that mark danger as merely decorative. When he lifted his queen, he expected the air to acknowledge ambition. The audience obliged. The child listened to a different music, the kind that counts squares and forgives nothing. She settled into the chair as if it were a cliff edge she had chosen. Around her, wealth rustled like tall grass hiding predators that prefer applause to camouflage. Her practice had taught her economy. Conserve commentary, spend attention. She measured the path of each minor piece like you measure winter groceries. One mistake, and the month grows longer. Breathing turned into metronome. The board brightened into a grid of bargains. She accepted small indignities, pressure on the king side, a cramped file, the way tenants accept thin walls and rising rent while planting a stubborn flower on the sill. Defenses overlapped. One weakness nursed another into strength. The knight became a shepherd, the bishop a rumor, the rook a gate. Somewhere in the crossing lines, a plan matured quietly, like bread beneath a towel. Silence had work to do. Spectacle could wait its turn.
He advanced as if he were owed squares. Open lines promised a familiar victory. Accumulate advantage, translate it into inevitability, punish any refusal to yield. His bishops sliced like policy memos. His rooks spoke in columns of force. Yet pressure that expects surrender often forgets that corners teach patience. She bent but did not splinter, accepted losses that cost little, constructed small fortresses from humble lumber. Patterns she had memorized in wind and thrift awoke, reminding her that expansion without attention breeds hollowness. He measured success by acreage, she measured it by cohesion. The audience applauded his aggression because drama prefers loudness. Somewhere beneath that noise, a pawn advanced 2 quiet squares early, then waited, patient as snowfall. A child's memory held it in place, an unremarkable fact, a seed under frost, still and invisible, destined for a different season. Tension grew heavy enough to alter posture. Power, feeling ignored, looked for other levers. He converted the room into a chorus, invited pity dressed as generosity, and dangled mercy like a chandelier, ornamental, unreachable, flattering to the one who owns the ceiling. Every word he let fall carried a message about ladders and who gets to climb. The old rulebook arrived: shame the poor into gratitude, then rescue them on your terms. The child did not attend the sermon. She visited the edges of the board where nothing famous happens, adjusted a piece by a hair's width, and saw 10 minutes into positions not yet born. Psychological warfare loses power against an opponent who takes nothing personally. In her steadiness, the room discovered an unfamiliar sensation, watching confidence fail to dictate reality. The game returned to wood, time, math, and nerve.
Spectacle has an instinct for crescendos. He offered one with practiced timing, lifting his queen as if unveiling a monument to destiny. The room recognized a story it loved, audacity rewarded, history repeating itself for the benefit of those who paid for good tables. The queen slid forward, daring catastrophe to blink. This was the move he built companies upon: overwhelm the middle, distract the edges, claim the prize while everyone applauds the method. Cameras breathed closer. Champagne paused mid-air. The sacrifice promised narrative, brilliance, cruelty disguised as genius, the inevitability of a signature above a ruin. His pulse steadied in anticipation of relief. The trap gleamed the way glass does before it shatters. Across from him, a child's eyes did not widen. She counted. She remembered winter light on cardboard squares. She traced an older line that ignored the queen's glamour entirely. She accepted the queen the way you accept a burden you trained to carry. Gasps offered the soundtrack he expected triumph to receive. He leaned toward the board with the hunger of a closing bell before a victory party. His pieces assembled like creditors. The attack arrived on schedule, loud, immediate, persuasive, angled to force panic or pride. Panic is expensive, pride is fatal. She purchased neither. A lane she had prepared earlier, disguised by ugliness and patience, opened like a service door in a palace. Along that corridor crept a pawn without ceremony. It represented rent paid on time, dinners stretched, bus rides counted, hours doubled, sleep sold wholesale. It moved because small things move or they disappear. The trap inside his trap made no speech. It advanced one square, then another. Attention, occupied by fireworks, missed the candle that was burning the map.
Hush expanded beyond politeness into something structural. Reporters paused mid-sentence as if the page had tilted. Guests leaned forward, their jewelry resisting gravity. In silence, the board's topography sharpened. Open files like riverbeds, diagonals like rails, seams where pressure collects before a wall gives. Sweat gathered where his collar met certainty. Pressure multiplies inside suits not built for it. She waited exactly long enough to transform patience into control. The gala's soundscape, forks, laughter, strings, fell behind glass. The audience, trained to cheer for winning, discovered the more frightening pleasure of watching invincibility misplace itself. Humiliation does not begin with a headline. It begins with a private understanding that the story will no longer accept you as protagonist. The pawn was nearly through. The path it walked was so plain that only superiority could fail to notice it. Superiority did. Promotion happened without fireworks. Wood became power because distance had been conquered square by square. The new queen did not arrive to avenge or boast. She arrived to complete geometry. Lines connected, roles reversed, force rearranged itself around humility. He stared as if the table had betrayed him. Checkmate sealed more than a game. It sealed a biography. A room built to showcase wealth became a courtroom where strategy and consequence ruled. The audience, sensing a hinge in the night, let their approval crack into applause. Somewhere at the edge, a mother found her breath again and held it like a document newly notarized. The child exhaled a lesson inked years ago on a park bench. Small pieces cross oceans when nobody guards the shore. In that final configuration lay a revelation about kingdoms that forget who keeps their gates.
Applause grows a second voice when it doesn't know where to land. It ricocheted between awe and appetite, then settled, to his horror, on the child. Cameras harvested angles. Social feeds wrote headlines without editors. The man who curated reality found himself rearranged by it. He adjusted his cuff as if dignity could be ironed. Wealth's friends built a polite distance, the social choreography that follows any stumble by a sovereign. He considered the practiced gestures that used to restore control: a toast, a line, a benefaction. None fit. The contract below this spectacle had the stubborn solidity of brick. Somewhere in the corridors, staff laughed in whispers that sounded like relief. A wager designed to dramatize contempt had become a mirror. He saw not simply defeat, but the machinery that had carried him to this exact square, exposed and noiseless. Sunlight is indifferent to embarrassment. It found him nonetheless, across headlines that preferred symmetry to mercy. The king undone by a pawn. The empire blinking. The narrative simplified itself for public consumption. The market shaved its opinion into numbers. Memes did their work, converting privilege into punchline at a speed he had once admired when it targeted rivals. He watched clips where his own laughter looped before the moment it inverted into stillness. The company's name trended with an adjective nobody in branding approves. Yet it was not the market's small slap that changed the air in his office. It was the knowledge that the contract had moved beyond theater into the bloodstream of law. Losing publicly is a wound. Losing irrevocably is a surgery. The boy who became a man of inevitabilities looked briefly like neither. Just a person.
Attempts were made to convert humiliation back into entertainment. Language assembled itself into an argument about performative intent, about charity stages and symbolic gestures. The law can be persuaded to admire pageantry. It cannot forgive signatures attached to terms with witnesses. Screenshots circulated with the cruelty of perfect memory. The stamp bled through the page like an old bruise. Advisors explained odds, and numbers did not barter. He felt for the first time the cage he built for others closing carefully around him. Compliance did not blink. Trustees followed instruction. The mechanism obeyed its architecture. The fight he wanted to win required the world to believe paperwork is posture. The world, for once, refused. Pride offered strategies that tasted like old victories.
He declined them all, not out of wisdom yet, but because they failed the math. The inevitable proceeded. Funds crossed their measured distance and settled into a name that carried no pedigree beyond steadfastness. The trust did not ring bells or throw confetti. It did not kneel. It simply existed, heavy and permanent, the way bridges exist after ribbon cuttings fade. The city resumed its noise. The company returned to meetings. Markets forgot at their usual pace. Yet a seam had opened that would not reseal. Somewhere, a small kitchen acquired the sound of a future loosening around it. Somewhere else, a man stared at art he had purchased to smother empty space and found it louder than the silence he feared. Wealth shifted category, not instrument, not armor, but admission. The board remained set in his mind, pieces frozen at the instant before he understood. Understanding is slower than loss. It arrives after the accounts settle, carrying a mirror.
Memory walked backward into a park where winter burned cheeks and a thermos fumed like a small locomotive. Walter Hayes had taught the game like a language carved from patience. His lessons were not metaphors, they were survival plans. In the tremor between the cold and his voice, a child learned that control is a sequence of small obediences to pattern, that panic wastes material, that sacrifice is not surrender when it buys a future. He never spoke of revenge, he spoke of staying. Pawns, he said without saying, are citizens. They do not volunteer for glory, they volunteer for arrival. Under streetlight halos, the battered board hosted campaigns no museum would commemorate. Those evenings installed a compass inside Claire that pointed toward squares others overlook. When the night at the gala called for courage, she did not summon genius. She summoned repetition. In a different office, history peeled back in Manila. Jack Callahan, who had built a career on retrieving facts strangers preferred to stay lost, produced a thin archive with thick consequences. The photo was older than most of the furniture. A younger Edward Whitmore Sr. at the mouth of a factory he would empty. A handshake that looked like a promise and operated like a blade. A man in a cheap suit, Walter Hayes, learning too late how acquisition sounds when it means erasure. Tiny black captions mattered. Dates, names, liens. The past revealed its ledgers with the politeness of a subpoena. Richard did not need a story told. He needed a context returned. In the grain of the image lived the original wager between power and people. The board had been set long before a gala invited an audience. A child had finished someone else's beginning.
The revelation did not arrive as scandal. It arrived as arithmetic. A theft recorded decades ago had accrued interest beyond money. Closed mouths, narrowed options, a family trained to count everything twice. The loss had traveled across lives like weather that never clears. Winning the game had not been luck, it had been inheritance of a different sort, a bequest of vigilance from a man who died holding the rules in his head. Justice does not wear crowns, it amends records. Richard saw his father's axioms, no rules, only results, raised to their adult conclusions. He also saw the limit of apologies. What was taken could not be returned intact, but value can be redirected. The path out of humiliation did not lead back toward triumph, it led forward toward repair. He placed the photo on his desk and understood that change required forfeiture. He came without the armor of tailoring, carrying the album like evidence in both directions. The room smelled of dinner and detergent, a combination he could not locate in his own homes. He noticed framed school photos and a plant determined to thrive despite stingy light. He set the album on a table that had survived more months than it deserved. Words arranged themselves carefully, not to persuade, but to confess. He did not ask forgiveness. He named a line of causality that ended in a wager he had mistaken for sport. The quiet in that apartment felt different than the quiet in his penthouse. It contained people instead of mirrors. Repair, he realized, would require building something that outlived disgrace. When he left, he took less with him than he brought, and that subtraction felt, for once, like profit.
Art left his walls and entered circulation as fuel. Paintings that once performed status transformed into seed for a concession designed to grow beyond his name. The Walter Hayes Foundation announced itself not with press releases, but with criteria. Protect small enterprises from predatory tactics. Anchor jobs in towns where main streets still remember parades. Fund modernization without extracting futures. Governance arrived with independence. Transparency replaced theater. Linda Hayes stepped into leadership like someone changing shoes before a longer road. She recruited staff who recognized resilience by callus and ledger, not by pitch deck. The foundation's first meeting sounded like revival and audit combined. Money, redirected, began to rehearse a morality it had not needed when it existed mainly to multiply. It learned to report to stories instead of appetites. In rooms far from marble, hope took the shape of grants. Inside the company that once worshipped speed, dissent arrived wearing respectability. A campaign of impatience marched through memos and into meetings. Martin Keene, embodiment of the quarterly horizon, framed compassion as contagion. He named caution irresponsibility, partnership weakness, memory and indulgence. Shareholders who do not live anywhere in particular demanded a geography of profit only they could inhabit. The revolt preferred statistics to faces and insisted the market's appetite was the same thing as truth. In that room, lighting too perfect to forgive error, Richard heard the old catechism return. Costs are people. Redundancies are towns. Synergies are paychecks in boxes. The battle that began on a chessboard widened. He understood that humiliation's final exam was not private shame, it was whether he would sell his new convictions to purchase old applause. He chose friction. Applause hesitated. Consequence did not.
The conference table extended like a runway for certainty. Claire was small at its edge, feet not yet consenting to the floor. She opened a notebook that had learned to hold diagrams beside grocery math. The plan before the board glowed with the elegance of destruction. Buy, carve, congratulate. She redrew it as a sequence of squares and arrows labeled with the lives they represented. Her notebook populated with pawn symbols, each standing for a worker, a mortgage, a team at a Little League field. She pointed, not with authority, but with accuracy, to the place where the profit predicted by the slide would first appear as hollow storefronts. The room's defenses, honed by decades, found themselves addressing a child who did not insult them, only unmasked their euphemisms. Silence considered an alternative, and for once, did not laugh it away. He recognized himself in the plan's elegance and decided to leave that version of himself behind. Commitment required a sentence longer than a headline. He replaced the vocabulary of conquest with the grammar of stewardship, instructing teams to calculate returns on trust, not just capital. Contracts would be rewritten to honor time as a partner instead of an enemy. The company would look for competitors to become collaborators, investing in capacity rather than collapse. The room did not cheer. Markets seldom reward patience immediately. He accepted the slope of a different curve, one that rises like a season instead of a fire. Reputation began, quietly, to notice. In towns the old strategy would have shuddered, machines hummed and cafeterias buzzed at noon. The decision felt like picking a harder endgame, because beauty matters more than speed when the board is the world.
The foundation's work measured itself in reopened doors, in payrolls met without loans that smelled like traps, in apprenticeships where calloused hands trained younger ones to outlast doubt. In Oregon, a woodworking shop found its rhythm again, sawdust and sunlight revealing the same patient glitter. A sun returned because possibility had returned first. Linda signed letters with a steadiness earned in rooms where people learned to count by necessity. Reports did not chase applause, they tallied resilience. The company learned to present success as something communities could feel without reading filings. Even those who had mocked the shift began to admit that stability tastes better than spectacle when winters run long. The story detached, at last, from a single humiliation. It attached to a network of repaired futures. The pawn's journey across the board sent small waves through places maps often ignore. 5 years later, the city's summer exhaled. In a park that remembers every season, a battered wooden board caught late light. Richard arrived with a thermos and the look of a man who had learned to count slower. Claire arranged pieces with the care of someone who values beginnings. Their games no longer negotiated ego, they rehearsed attention. He lost again, and the loss felt clean, like a window opened to air a room. Around them, people passed with groceries and laughter, ordinary as grace. The board reflected the world they were learning to build. Positions complicated by responsibility, outcomes tempered by care. The queen rested beside a pawn, distance conquered without gloating. Overhead, leaves kept their counsel. In the quiet afterward, a truth settled like soft rain. The work of justice is not a finale. It is a practice, renewed square by square.